Sarah Mitchell stepped off the military transport plane, her boots hitting the dusty ground of Camp Phoenix with practiced precision. The Afghan heat immediately wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but she didn't flinch. After 3 deployments, the desert had become as familiar as her childhood home in Ohio. She adjusted the strap of her medical bag and surveyed the base. Rows of tan-colored buildings stretched across the compound, with soldiers moving between them like ants in a well-organized colony. The familiar sounds of military life filled the air, helicopter rotors in the distance, the rumble of vehicles, and the constant chatter of radio communications. Sarah had been assigned to Camp Phoenix as a combat medic, but her background was far from ordinary. Few people knew about her previous life, and she preferred it that way. The Army records showed her medical training, her exemplary service record, and her multiple commendations for bravery under fire. What they didn't show was the classified training she'd received years earlier, or the missions that officially never happened. As she made her way to the medical tent, Sarah noticed a commotion near the command center. A group of officers stood in heated discussion, their voices carrying across the dusty ground. She recognized the tension in their postures. Something was wrong. "Medic Mitchell, report to Colonel Anderson immediately," a young corporal called out, jogging toward her. Sarah nodded and changed direction, wondering what could require her attention so quickly after arrival. The command tent was a hub of activity, with maps covering every available surface and radio operators maintaining constant communication with units in the field. Colonel Anderson looked up as she entered, his weathered face showing the strain of command. "Mitchell, good timing. We've got a situation developing in Sector 7. One of our patrols has gone silent and we're preparing a search and rescue operation." Sarah listened as he briefed her on the missing patrol, 6 soldiers who had been conducting a routine security sweep near a village about 20 kilometers north. Their last communication had been 3 hours ago, reporting all clear before radio silence descended like a curtain. "We're sending out 2 Humvees with a full squad," the colonel continued. "I want you with them in case we find casualties." As Sarah prepared her equipment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this mission felt different. The village in question was in an area known for its relative stability, not the kind of place where patrols typically went missing. She'd learned to trust her instincts over the years, and they were telling her to be extra careful. The rescue convoy departed just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Sarah rode in the second vehicle, watching the landscape roll past through the bulletproof glass. The terrain was a mixture of rocky hills and sparse vegetation, punctuated by the occasional mud brick structure that had probably stood unchanged for centuries. The convoy commander was Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran with multiple tours under his belt. He kept up a steady stream of communication with base, updating their position and maintaining contact with other units in the area. Everyone was on edge, knowing that radio silence usually meant trouble. When they reached the last known position of the missing patrol, the convoy stopped and the soldiers dismounted. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and followed the team as they began their search pattern. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind across the barren ground. They found the abandoned Humvees about a quarter mile from the road, hidden behind a cluster of large rocks. The vehicles showed no signs of damage, but they were completely empty. No bodies, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the 6-man patrol. Rodriguez immediately called for backup and established a security perimeter while his team searched for clues. Sarah examined the vehicles for any medical evidence that might explain the disappearance, but found nothing unusual. It was as if the soldiers had simply vanished into thin air. As the search expanded, one of the soldiers called out from a position about 50 meters away. He'd found something, equipment that clearly belonged to the missing patrol scattered across a small clearing. Body armor, weapons, and personal items lay strewn about in what appeared to be a hasty abandonment. Sarah was examining a discarded first aid kit when she heard the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors approaching. She looked up to see a Black Hawk descending toward their position, its downwash creating a dust storm that forced everyone to take cover. From the helicopter emerged a figure that immediately commanded attention. General Marcus Stone was a legend in military circles, a man whose reputation had been forged in decades of conflict zones around the world. His presence here meant this situation had just become much more serious than anyone had realized. The general strode toward the search team with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His eyes quickly assessed the scene, taking in the abandoned vehicles and scattered equipment with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen it all before. "Status report," he demanded, and Rodriguez quickly briefed him on their findings. General Stone listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Rodriguez finished, the general walked over to examine the abandoned equipment himself, his trained eye looking for details that others might miss. Sarah continued her own examination of the medical supplies, but she couldn't help watching the general work. There was something about his methodical approach that reminded her of her own training from years past, training that few people in the regular army would recognize. As the sun continued to sink toward the horizon, the search took on increased urgency. Night in this region brought its own dangers, and the missing soldiers had been gone far too long already. Additional units were being called in, and the camp was mobilizing for a full-scale search and rescue operation. It was then that Sarah noticed something that others had missed: a small mark carved into a rock near where the equipment had been found. To most people, it would have looked like random scratches or natural weathering. But to someone with the right training, it told a very different story. The mark was a signal, carefully placed and deliberately concealed. It was the kind of communication method used by special operations forces when standard radio protocols couldn't be trusted. Sarah stared at the mark for a long moment, her mind racing as she recognized its significance. She glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the other soldiers were focused on their own areas of responsibility. Only General Stone was nearby, and he was studying the terrain with an intensity that suggested he was thinking along similar lines. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She approached the general, her heart pounding as she prepared to reveal knowledge that she'd kept hidden for years. The mark on the rock wasn't just any signal. It was something specific, something that would identify exactly who had made it and why. "General Stone," she said quietly, making sure her voice wouldn't carry to the other soldiers. He turned to look at her, his sharp eyes immediately focusing on her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading her thoughts. "I found something you need to see," Sarah continued, leading him toward the rock where she'd discovered the mark. As they walked, she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. What she was about to reveal would expose secrets that she'd sworn never to discuss, but the lives of 6 soldiers hung in the balance. Sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives. The general followed her to the rock, and Sarah pointed out the carved mark. For a moment, he stared at it silently, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes snapped back to her face with a sharpness that made her breath catch. "Do you know what this is, medic?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah met his gaze steadily, knowing that her answer would reveal everything about her hidden past. The next words out of her mouth would either save 6 lives or destroy her carefully constructed new identity forever. Sarah took a deep breath and met General Stone's penetrating stare. The carved mark on the rock seemed to pulse with significance between them, a silent testament to secrets that ran deeper than either of them had initially realized. "It's a seal trident mark," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Specifically, it's the emergency extraction signal that Team 6 uses when operations go dark." The general's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching shock. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face with new intensity, as if seeing her for the first time. "Only SEALs use that signal," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded and reached into her shirt, pulling out a chain that she'd kept hidden beneath her uniform. Hanging from it was a small, worn metal pin, a sealed trident that had been her constant companion for years, even after she'd officially left that world behind. The general stared at the pin for a long moment, then back at her face. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Who are you really, Medic Mitchell?" "Sarah Mitchell, Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, formerly attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group," she replied, using the official designation for SEAL Team 6. "I served for 4 years before transferring to Army Medical Corps. The pieces of a complex puzzle were falling into place in the general's mind. He'd heard whispers about female SEALs operating in classified programs, but he'd never encountered one personally. The official records would be buried so deep that even his security clearance might not access them. "The missing patrol," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You think they're alive?" "The signal indicates a forced extraction scenario," Sarah explained, pointing to specific details in the carved mark that would be meaningless to anyone without the proper training. "See the angle of these lines? That means they were taken, not killed. And this symbol here indicates they left the mark voluntarily, which means they were conscious and able to think tactically when it happened." General Stone processed this information rapidly, his military mind immediately grasping the implications. If the soldiers had been captured rather than killed, it changed everything about the rescue operation. It also meant they were running out of time. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Based on SEAL protocols, maybe 6 to 8 hours before they're moved too far for practical rescue," Sarah replied. "The mark is fresh, probably left within the last hour or two." The general activated his radio and began issuing rapid orders. Additional units were being deployed, satellite surveillance was being redirected, and intelligence assets were being mobilized to track any movement in the region. But even as he coordinated the massive response, his attention kept returning to the woman standing beside him. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your background when you enlisted in the Army?" he asked during a brief pause in his communications. Sarah's expression grew distant for a moment. "Because some doors, once you walk through them, you can never really go back. I wanted a normal military career, helping people instead of—" She trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. The general understood. He'd seen enough special operations personnel struggle with the transition back to conventional military life. The skills that made them exceptional in classified missions often made it difficult to fit into regular units. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the rescue operation shifted into high gear. Night vision equipment was distributed, additional aircraft were brought in, and teams of specialists began arriving from other bases. But despite all the activity, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. She studied the carved signal again, this time paying attention to details she'd initially overlooked. There were secondary marks, barely visible scratches that could easily be dismissed as natural weathering. But to someone trained to read them, they told a more complete story. "General," she called out, gesturing for him to return to the rock. "What is it?" "There's more," Sarah said, pointing to the additional marks. "These symbols indicate direction and approximate distance. Whoever left this was trying to tell us exactly where they were being taken." The additional information painted a clear picture. The captured patrol was being moved northeast, toward a region known for its complex cave systems and hidden valleys. It was terrain that would be nearly impossible to search effectively without specific intelligence about the exact location. General Stone immediately relayed this information to his intelligence team, and within minutes, satellite images were being analyzed and reconnaissance drones were being dispatched to the indicated area. The technology was impressive, but Sarah knew from experience that it might not be enough. "I need to go with the rescue team," she said suddenly. The general looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. You're a medic, not an assault specialist." "With respect, sir, I'm the only one here who can read the complete signal protocols, Sarah replied firmly. If they leave additional marks along their route, your team might miss them. And if this situation goes bad, you're going to need someone with advanced medical training who can operate under fire. The argument made sense, but the general was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of sending a medic into what was shaping up to be a dangerous rescue operation. Sarah could see the conflict in his expression as he weighed the tactical advantages against the risks. Besides, she added quietly, if those soldiers are really using SEAL protocols, it means they're treating this like a special operations scenario. That suggests their captors aren't ordinary insurgents. You might need someone with unconventional warfare experience. Before the general could respond, his radio crackled to life with an urgent report from one of the reconnaissance drones. They'd spotted movement in the target area. Vehicles traveling without lights along what appeared to be an old smuggling route that led deep into the mountains. The intelligence officer's voice was tense as he provided details. Sir, we're tracking 3 vehicles moving in convoy formation. They appear to be heading toward a compound that's not on any of our maps. Estimated arrival time at current speed is 45 minutes. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. If the captors reached their destination, extracting the captured soldiers would become exponentially more difficult. Mountain compounds in this region were often heavily fortified and could easily be defended by a small force against a much larger attacking unit. We need to move now, she urged. Once they reach that compound, you'll be looking at a siege situation instead of a rescue operation. General Stone made his decision with the swift certainty of a career military officer. Rodriguez, get your team ready to move. We're going in fast and light. He turned to Sarah. You're with them, but you stay back unless specifically needed. Your job is medical support, not assault. Sarah nodded her agreement, though she suspected that the distinction might not hold once they reached the target area. She'd learned long ago that military operations rarely went according to plan, and this one already had the feel of something that was going to require improvisation. As the rescue team prepared their equipment and vehicles, Sarah checked her medical supplies and ensured her weapon was properly maintained. The familiar weight of the pistol on her hip was comforting, even though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The helicopters that would transport them to the target area were already spinning up, their rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and noise that made communication difficult. Sarah climbed aboard the lead aircraft, settling in beside Rodriguez and his team as they conducted final equipment checks. As the helicopter lifted off and banked toward the mountains, Sarah looked down at the lights of Camp Phoenix growing smaller in the distance. She'd come to Afghanistan as a medic seeking a quiet deployment, but fate had thrust her back into the world she'd tried to leave behind. Through the aircraft's window, the Afghan landscape rolled past like a dark ocean dotted with occasional lights. Somewhere out there, 6 American soldiers were counting on their training and their teammates to bring them home safely. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to center herself, drawing on the mental discipline that had been drilled into her during years of high-stress operations. The helicopter's intercom crackled to life as the pilot provided an update on their approach to the target area. They would be on the ground in less than 20 minutes, and after that, everything would depend on speed, precision, and a little bit of luck. Sarah opened her eyes and looked around at the faces of the soldiers surrounding her. They were good people, dedicated, brave, and well-trained. But none of them had experience with the kind of situation they might be walking into. If her instincts were correct, this wasn't going to be a standard rescue operation. The aircraft suddenly banked sharply to the right, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom with urgent intensity. We've got movement on the ground. Looks like our targets have reached their destination. Through the window, Sarah could see lights flickering in what appeared to be a small valley surrounded by steep rocky walls. The compound was larger than she'd expected, with multiple buildings and what looked like defensive positions around the perimeter. As they circled the area for reconnaissance, Sarah studied the layout and felt her heart sink. The compound was built like a fortress, with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes leading deeper into the mountains. Getting the captured soldiers out alive was going to require more than just firepower and determination. It was going to require a miracle. The helicopter touched down on a rocky plateau about a mile from the compound, its engines shutting down to minimize noise that might alert the captors. Sarah and the rescue team moved quickly through the darkness, their night vision equipment turning the treacherous mountain terrain into a green-tinted landscape of shadows and obstacles. Rodriguez led the team with practiced efficiency, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his movements as they approached the compound. This wasn't the kind of operation any of them had trained for extensively, and the stakes couldn't be higher. As they crept closer to the target, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race. Another mark, carved into a boulder near what appeared to be the main approach to the compound. She signaled for Rodriguez to stop and examined the new symbol carefully. "They're still alive," she whispered, "and they're in the central building. But there's a problem. This mark indicates they're being held separately, probably to prevent them from coordinating any escape attempt." The information changed their tactical approach completely. Instead of a single coordinated assault, they would need to split their forces to hit multiple targets simultaneously. Rodriguez immediately began adjusting his plan, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes as he realized how thin they would be spread. Through her night vision scope, Sarah studied the compound's defenses. Guards moved in predictable patterns around the perimeter, and there were at least 3 defensive positions that could rain fire down on any approaching force. It was a professional setup, suggesting their opponents were far from ordinary insurgents. "This feels wrong," Rodriguez muttered, echoing Sarah's own thoughts. "How did a routine patrol get captured by people this organized?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing, but there wasn't time to explore the question now. The captured soldiers needed immediate rescue, and every minute they delayed increased the risk that the captors would move them to an even more secure location. The rescue team split into 3 groups, each targeting a different building based on Sarah's interpretation of the SEAL signals. She found herself assigned to Rodriguez's group, which would assault the central building where the signals indicated the largest number of hostages were being held. As they moved into position for the coordinated attack, Sarah's radio crackled with an encrypted transmission that made her blood run cold. It was General Stone, providing intelligence that changed everything about their understanding of the situation. "All units, be advised. Satellite surveillance indicates this compound is being used as a meeting point for high-value terrorist targets. You may be walking into more than a simple hostage situation." The revelation explained the professional level of security they'd observed, but it also meant the rescue operation had just become exponentially more dangerous. If the compound really was hosting a terrorist summit, the number of armed hostiles could be far greater than anticipated. Rodriguez looked at Sarah through the darkness, his expression clearly asking whether they should abort and call for reinforcements. But she shook her head slightly, knowing that waiting for additional support would likely mean the death of the captured patrol. "We go with the original plan," she whispered into her radio. "Fast and surgical. Get our people out before anyone has time to react." The assault began with precisely coordinated explosions that breached the compound's outer defenses simultaneously. Rodriguez's team moved through the smoke and confusion toward the central building, while the other groups attacked their respective targets. Sarah followed close behind the assault team, her medical bag ready for immediate treatment of any wounded they might encounter. But as they burst through the building's entrance, she realized that her medical training might not be the most important skill she brought to this mission. The interior of the building was a maze of corridors and rooms that seemed designed to confuse and delay any attacking force. Rodriguez and his team moved methodically through the structure, checking each room for hostages while maintaining security against potential counterattacks. It was in the 3rd room they searched that Sarah spotted something the others had missed. Another SEAL signal, this one scratched into the wooden frame of a doorway. But this mark was different from the others, carrying a warning that made her heart race. "Stop!" she hissed, grabbing Rodriguez's arm before he could move toward the next corridor. "That's a booby trap warning." The signal indicated that the corridor ahead was rigged with explosives, probably triggered by pressure plates or tripwires that would be nearly invisible in the darkness. Moving forward without proper equipment would be suicide. Rodriguez immediately called for the team's explosive ordnance specialist, but Sarah was already studying the warning signal more carefully. The mark contained additional information, a specific pathway through the trapped area that would allow safe passage for someone who knew how to read it. "I can get us through," she said quietly, "but we'll have to move single file and follow the exact route marked in the signal." Rodriguez looked skeptical. But the alternative was waiting for EOD equipment that might not arrive in time to save the hostages. After a moment of consideration, he nodded grimly and gestured for his team to form a single-file column behind Sarah. Moving through the trapped corridor was like navigating a deadly maze in the dark. Sarah read each subtle signal left by the captured SEALs, adjusting their path to avoid the carefully concealed explosive devices. One wrong step would kill them all, but somehow the route held, and they emerged safely into a wider chamber at the building's center. The hostages were there, all 6 members of the missing patrol, bound and guarded by 3 armed captors who looked up in shock as the rescue team burst through what they had believed to be an impassable corridor. The brief firefight that followed was intense, but one-sided, with Rodriguez's team quickly overwhelming the surprised guards. Sarah immediately moved to assess the condition of the rescued soldiers, while Rodriguez's team secured the area. All 6 were alive, though showing signs of rough treatment and stress. As she worked to free them from their restraints, one of the rescued soldiers grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "You read the signals," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with amazement. "How did you know the protocols?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor they'd just navigated. More captors were coming, probably alerted by the sound of gunfire, and the rescue team found themselves trapped in the central chamber with limited ammunition and no easy escape route. Rodriguez was already coordinating with the other rescue teams, but their reports were grim. Both other buildings had contained more hostiles than expected, and the entire compound was now fully alert and mobilizing against the rescue operation. "We need another way out," Rodriguez said grimly, studying the chamber for alternative exits. Sarah was thinking the same thing, but her attention was drawn to something one of the rescued soldiers was trying to tell her. Despite his obvious exhaustion and stress, he was gesturing toward a section of the chamber's wall that looked no different from any other part of the rough stone construction. "There's a tunnel," he whispered. "We saw them using it when they brought us in. Hidden entrance behind that section of wall." Sarah approached the indicated area and began searching for the concealed mechanism that would open the passage. Her fingers traced along the stone surface until she found what felt like a loose block that shifted slightly under pressure. The wall section swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that led away from the compound into the mountain itself. It was probably an old smuggling route or defensive escape passage, but right now it represented their only chance of getting the hostages out alive. "Move! Move! Move!" Rodriguez ordered, and the combined group of rescuers and rescued soldiers began filing through the tunnel as the sounds of approaching hostiles grew louder. Sarah went last, pausing only to activate a small explosive device that would collapse the tunnel entrance behind them. The technique was something she'd learned during her SEAL training, and it would buy them precious minutes to escape before their pursuers could follow. The tunnel was a nightmare of cramped spaces and uncertain footing, but it led steadily away from the compound and deeper into the mountains. After what felt like hours of crawling through the darkness, they finally emerged onto a rocky hillside, about 2 miles from their starting point. Rodriguez immediately called for extraction, and within minutes they could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching through the night sky. As the rescue aircraft touched down to collect them, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe they had actually pulled off the impossible. General Stone was waiting when they returned to Camp Phoenix, his expression a mixture of relief and curiosity, as he watched the rescued soldiers being taken for medical evaluation. When he approached Sarah, she could see questions in his eyes that would probably never be fully answered. "The signals worked," he said simply. Sarah nodded, pulling off her equipment and feeling the exhaustion of the past several hours settling into her bones. "They always do, if you know how to read them." "And if you know how to use them," the general added pointedly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity around them as the base processed the successful rescue mission. Finally, the general spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Your transfer request to Army Medical was approved because someone very high up the chain wanted you to have a chance at a normal military career," he said. "But tonight proved that some skills never really go away." Sarah smiled slightly, understanding the implication in his words. "With respect, General, I'm exactly where I want to be. Sometimes the best way to serve is by helping people heal instead of creating more wounds." The general nodded slowly, seeming to accept her answer. As he walked away, Sarah looked up at the Afghan sky, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. The mission was over, the hostages were safe, and she could return to the quiet anonymity of her medical duties. But deep down, she knew that General Stone was right about one thing. Some skills never really went away. The signals, the training, the ability to operate in impossible situations would always be part of who she was, hidden beneath the surface like a secret strength that could emerge when lives hung in the balance. As she made her way back to the medical tent to write her report on the night's events, Sarah reflected on the strange turn her deployment had taken. She'd come to Afghanistan seeking a peaceful assignment, but instead had found herself thrust back into the world of classified operations and dangerous rescues. The carved signals that had made the rescue possible were probably already being erased by wind and weather, returning to invisibility just as Sarah herself would fade back into the anonymity of regular military service. But for one night, those ancient SEAL protocols had been the difference between 6 soldiers coming home alive or disappearing forever into the mountains of Afghanistan. And sometimes, Sarah thought as she opened the medical tent's door and stepped back into her normal world, that was enough.